was the last week of March 1985 that we, a group of geographers from the Department of Social and Economic Geography at Lund, made an excursion to France. This film is made to document some of our adventures and experiences, what we saw, heard and noticed, and what we learned and were able to bring home and maybe use in our work in Sweden. The tour consisted of two parts. At first we spent 3 days in Paris, where we visited institutions, met researchers and students, and made the acquaintance with the French capital. The second part of the journey was a bus trip around Brittany. We arrived in Paris Monday morning. The first afternoon we made a visit at Laboratoire Éco-Éthologie Humaine at Institut Marcel Rivière in Le Mesnil-Saint-Denis, where Professor Claude Leroy presented his research.
And I worked too with UNESCO in the program of MEAD for the project 11, urban ecosystem. And it is interesting to see now the project is made with men. They are not urbanists, but they are geographers, sociologues, or psychologists, and so on. It is a multidisciplinary approach of the environment.
His studies is a part of the International Man and Biosphere project, which is supported by UNESCO. With a series of dia slides, Professor Leroy illustrated how we perceive borderlines and more complex environments. Studies of perception and behavior of persons with pathological changes give understanding of how it works in normal people. Those environments that are good for mentally ill are also good for normal persons. An electroencephalogram, an EEC, catches a simplified picture of the inner reactions of the person when he perceives a certain environment. It gives the sum of electrical change in the nerve cells of the brain. The complexity in the EEC depends on the complexity of the perception. In general, pathological changes lead to a stabilization of the pattern. Professor Leroy also told us about studies made of people living in different environments. The relations between the individuals in a family and their sensitivity for external stimuli are very dependent on the environment and the amount of positive and negative stimuli that reaches the members of the family. Madame Pizzorni-Iti from the Eco Museum in Saint-Quentin-en-Yvelines, one of the new towns in the Paris region, situated not far from the Institute, told us about eco-museums. There are about 20 eco-museums in France. The thought behind them is to connect the historical development to today's situation. They use an arena perspective where the relations in both time and space are essential. The theme varies in general with the historical background or the environment of the particular museum. In Saint-Quentin, the ambitions are to study the local history and follow the development, to develop a center of documentation for the area, to develop people's knowledge and interest for the area through exhibitions and other activities, and to participate in the forming of the local environment. Tuesday morning we visited Atelier Parisien d'Urbanisme, which is the organization that plans the city of Paris. Christine Florent presented the organization and its work.
Donc quand nous parlons de documents d'urbanisme, de plans, ça ne concerne toujours que Paris intramuros, et pas la région, qui elle-même a fait un schéma directeur qui a été approuvé, qui est en révision actuellement. Mais donc le schéma directeur de Paris, qui est représenté ici et qu'on va vous projeté en diapositive, donc le plan qui se trouve derrière, dont on parlera un peu, a été approuvé en 1977.
The area concerned is the 20th arrondissement and the two woods Vincennes and Boulogne, which has an area of about 10,000 hectares. The atelier is financed by the state, the region and the city of Paris. The mayor of Paris is chairman of the board. 70 persons are employed. The main tasks are collection of statistics, computer cartography, analysis of demographic and social development, and the solving of problems concerning, for example, housing, commerce and traffic. Mademoiselle Florent presented with dia slides some examples of present work. The areas marked on this map are ongoing projects. Le Marais around Place de Vosges is one of the areas of particular concern. It is a very special region in the city with a lot of noble houses, hôtels. Between them there are narrow streets with a lot of artisans and small shops. The houses are usually built between the 16th and the 19th centuries. Since the 1960s, when the area could be described as slum, a lot of restoration work has been going on, and now a plan is to be presented. Among other things, this plan contains suggestions on how to preserve the character of the area for the future. A lot of old industrial areas in the city are changing functions. In Cevennes, by the river Seine in the southwest, where the huge Citroën factories were, one is now planning for living houses and large green areas. The former industrial banks of Canal Saint-Martin are turned into green promenades and yacht harbours. Forum is perhaps the most famous example of this development. Les Halles have been replaced by mixed living houses, some of these social housing, shopping centres and subterranean sport facilities. Madame le Professeur Beaujeu-Garnier presented a historical background to the present situation in the Paris region.
The city island is here. That's the birth of Paris. And in Paris, you have at the present time 2,200,000 people. And at the maximum, this place of Paris, with its surface, had a maximum population of 3 millions between 1911 and 1931. Since 1931, population began to decrease because the density was very high and very inconvenient for a modern life. So people have begun to leave the center of Paris, and at the present time you have 3 millions at the maximum, and now we have 2,200,000. But around Paris itself, you have the agglomeration. The agglomeration of Paris is 9 million inhabitants, which are included in the surroundings and in the center of the agglomeration. The agglomeration is increasing constantly around farther and farther from the center. You have generally good railways and good highways, and all these have a radial extension. So the people at the present time leave the center of the agglomeration. Paris itself is decreasing, and the first part of the banlieue, which is just here, is decreasing too. The population is decreasing, and the population is increasing strongly on the external fringe of the agglomeration. So you have a perpetual change of population between the center and the surroundings. And it's a very pity because at the present time very good agricultural lands are occupied year by year, farther and farther from the center. And it begins to be a little too much.
The dominance of the area is quite extreme. On 2% of the total area of France, there are today 18% of the population, 1/4 of those employed in industry, 1/3 of those employed in commerce, and 4/5 of the artists. For the 1950s, there was no regulation of land use, and the development was spontaneous and caused a lot of problems. That is why the spatial administration for the Paris region was created in 1961, and a plan, Schéma directeur d'aménagement et d'urbain de la région parisienne, was presented in 1965. Most important point in this plan was perhaps the creation of 8 villes nouvelles, new towns. The number was later reduced to 5. These new towns were to become attraction zones and contain 400 to 700,000 inhabitants. In the afternoon we visited one of these, Évry, situated about 30 kilometers south of Paris. Our guides were Professor Marlin and Madame de Paris. Évry is built up from scratch with neighborhood unities and green areas in between. Huge areas are not yet occupied, and this gives the impression of large intern distances. The architectural styles are varied in the International Functionalist School. One can tell that there hasn't been a lack of money behind the project. In Évry, like everywhere else, one has tried to get clean high technological industries. Évry has probably been able to offer very good conditions because some electrotechnical industries, among them Hewlett and Packard, have settled there. The main problem areas of today's Paris seems to be general problems of space in the city center, especially for offices, traffic and green areas. Housing. Getting rid of the slums and greater amount of social housing in the inner city are two of the goals. We also had the opportunity to meet French students. Wednesday morning we had, for example, a meeting with French geographers at the Centre Culturel Suédois, the Swedish Cultural Center. Professor Paul Claval presented the historical development of French geography, and we told them about Swedish geography. Afterwards, we had a discussion and made many interesting contacts. It is by speaking to people you really come into touch with a foreign country and a foreign culture. One of the highlights of the trip was indeed our visit on the Swedish embassy, where we had a reception to which we had invited French geographers and other interesting persons. Before the reception we had a meeting with the ambassador Carl Lidbom and the attaché Eric Belfrage, where they informed us about the political situation in France. Thursday morning we started our tour to Brittany. We were accompanied by some French students and Professor Bill Mead from London. The last evening in Rennes we sat down and discussed our impressions.
What was really the new experience was going along with Mr. FLATRES, a man that knows everything about this landscape as far as I can understand. It was really a new dimension, traveling with him, knowing all about the history and all about the culture and all about the present situation of this part of France.
Yes, I really do agree with you. I felt the same. Also, I have been here before, so it was very nice to have all those explanations on things you had seen but not understood before. And I think it's also amazing to think of that Monsieur FLATRES, as I understood it, he's quite unique in French geography and perhaps even in French history, knowing all this. And this, I think, is something to think of even in our Swedish conditions. That perhaps this kind of knowledge is you should try to put it forward again.
But I think we have had good help with Mr. FLATRES because his way of putting the small places into a bigger dimension.
Yes.
And he see it in spite of the rest of the world.
Yes. You really
It's
have
unique.
Yes. You really have the feeling that he knows this area, and every village you travel through, he knows someone. Mm-hmm. He just don't know everything about the church and the buildings. He knows an artisan or a peasant or something about the people as well.
That's one point, but there's another more important point, is that you see here those flat expanses, which is for geographers and I suppose for people from the north as well, a slicker, what's in Dutch called slicker. See? It's a kind of, which is covered by the tide every day. And there's no vegetation, and these slickers extended to the farms and the fields there, probably at the beginning of the Middle Ages, when the abbey was founded. And then a score began to form with grass on top of it. And this score grew very slowly for centuries. And in the 20s or 30s, something very queer occurred, that a new grass was noticed here, of the genus Spartina. There is an indigenous Spartina, which is Spartina, I don't know the specific name, but another Spartina appeared, Spartina townsendi, which was thought to come from America. See? Now somebody thinks it's a spontaneous hybrid of two Spartinas, I don't know, but anyhow it was thought at the time that it came from America. Then it appeared near Le Havre, I think, and moved gradually westwards and got into the bay here about the mid-20s or 30s. And it has a peculiarity that it has very thick roots, a number of roots which fix the sand and the mud. See, at each side. So when Spartina expanded, the shore began to expand very quickly. And the Spartina expanded to the other slicks on the west, near Saint-Brieuc and where it probably near the Finistère now. And then, from then on, the score extended to such an extent that along the dike it is almost now reaching the Mont Saint-Michel.
And how Monsieur FLATRES has spoken of how important the earth is to the people.
Yeah, especially here in Britain.
Yes.
There's a strong tradition of, what do you call it? There's a strong tradition to sticking to the region, as it were.
Yes.
To belonging to the region.
Yes.
Different
He mentioned,
aspects.
yes.
Yeah.
He mentioned that too. several times.
Yeah.
To be a Briton, it's something special.
Well, it's easy to forget that when living in more industrialized areas, that when you come out to this more marginal areas, so to say, we saw the same in Ireland, for example.
Oh, yes.
People living much closer to nature, and even if you know it, you tend to forget it when staying around in cities every day.
Yes. Yes, that's right.
I asked Monsieur FLATRES about this building material, everybody building in stone here, and he said that, well, we have always built in stone since the Neolithic, since Karnak, and since then they had quarried stone in stone quarries and transported those huge stones for very long distances. And this, I think, gives you the time dimension again on this countryside, because they always built in stone. They always managed to handle those stone materials. One thing that struck me coming from Sweden, with all those nucleated villages and the medieval churches in them, was that here we have a scattering of churches and chapels all over the country, not connected with the parish system, which is later here than the chapels. And this was something different for me.
In Saint-Égonec, the churchyard is enclosed. The entrance is through a triumphal arch called the Arch of the Dead. There are many beautiful churches in Brittany. They are all typical, built in stone, and most of them in the Middle Ages. People have often identified themselves very strongly with the church and their parish. The Church of La Cournant is an example of the Breton Gothic style. It is a monument over a very wealthy period created by textile manufacturing around the 16th century.
But at the same time, you really have the feeling, and through what Mr. FLATRES said and the things about the chapels and such things, is that this is a part that has not been very close to France through the times. It's been a place of its own. And also what struck me, for example, in Dinan, was that Mr. FLATRES said that this place is in many senses, or has been through history, closer to England than it has been to even Rennes and certainly Paris and other parts of France. And people in this area growing vegetables and selling it to England, and the close connections with England over the Channel.
The English garden, which is at the back, is named thus because retired English military people, especially those in the Indian service, found this region to be a better place for retirement than Jersey or England. It was cheaper to live here, and they established an English church and an English culture around here. That's why they call it the Jardin d'Anglais. Okay.
C'est derrière l'église.
C'est loin?
Non, non. 500.
I mean, the innovation stream wasn't going out from Paris or something like that, because he was talking about instead how well situated Brittany was. I mean, in terms of education and other things,
yes.
And how it spread out from that.
Mm-hmm.
Because, of course, also in terms of the location. I mean, the connection to the Western.
Yes, it should be a remain of an old situation when it was the people on the shores who were the open-minded ones,
yes.
with outer contacts, and the people inland who were the people who just stayed in their own situation.
Yeah. regional inequalities, which we have been reading before we went here. I didn't get that impression that you could see so much of what we have learned and read about before.
You mean the regional problems?
The regional problems.
Exactly.
So you couldn't see that the houses were good and they were all facilities and an infrastructure were built up.
Yeah.
And the people, it was rather new. Of course, it was mixed new and old places, but most of it was very, very good, I think.
Yeah, I remember we were talking about that on the bus when we
Yes.
rode through. Can't remember where that place was. Somewhere in the western Britain. When we said that all the time Britain is being presented as a problem region, as a region where people really have a hard life in a way, but you can't see this in the same way you could see it in Eastern Germany, for instance, or some other underdeveloped European regions.
But that's interesting to see and to compare with what do they mean? Do they mean in a more economical way if you put in the industrial side and if you just taking to how they live and what they do and how.
Well,
maybe don't have mentioned you have some ideas about that too.
Well, I have seen the same phenomenon in Sweden, in the very north of Sweden, in Tornedalen, where when you travel there, this area is an extreme travel area with respect to jobs. And still, when you pass the single-family houses, they are all tip-top, built the year before or very good restored.
Yeah.
And that is, of course, an effect of that. The regional subsidies in Sweden, in great part, take form as a subsidy of dwellings and investments in dwellings. And of course, it could be the same phenomenon here.
Une salle des sports, enfin une salle omnisport, une maison de la culture et tout un équipement sur le plan scolaire et sur le plan universitaire. De photos sur les quartiers et la politique générale de la ville.
I have been working now for 3 years in the city of Malmö, which is a municipality of about 200,000 inhabitants, and it was very interesting for me to have this visit in Rennes, where the mayor told us about its recent evolution and what problems they have today. Because I think about 80 or 90% of the things he mentioned could have been said about Malmö too. I mean, there was this rapid growth after World War II up to now. There was this heavy tearing down of buildings in order to restore the center and to raise the standard of living in the dwellings, which has now come to an end where they find out that they must save more of the old houses and instead renew the house they have. And there was this problem of jobs when they start to seek for peak industries to get a long run stability in the number of jobs. And point after point that he mentioned could have been mentioned in Malmö too.
People are still living in villages and out in the countryside in those old houses that we have seen. And I think this poses a great problem, which we have seen, taking into account that this countryside and those villages are still evolving, and there is a planning to them, and many things happen to them today because society changes, and we have seen how the planners evolve new towns, big, huge structures around Paris, and how they change totally the landscape. And on the other hand, we have seen those old structures which also have to be changed, the bocages, the hedges being taken away for economic reasons in agriculture and things like that. And what struck me was that the planners of the modern landscape, the new towns or the road builders, the new roads, seem to have a lack of knowledge of the value of this historical dimension. And Monsieur FLATRES, he spoke of this several times. Well, now they have built a hotel here, they shouldn't have built it there, and they have built a road here, and there through this moorland, and they shouldn't have built it there for environmental reasons and for historical reasons. And he had the knowledge on the history and the value of it, and the planners seem to lack this knowledge. And this, I think, is serious, because I think you could keep the historical dimension even in a newly planned landscape.
Comparing the new towns and the old towns, medieval towns, I think people in the medieval towns in some way must be more happier and satisfied, because they have a natural tradition, a natural way of living. And new towns, I think it's kind of frightening when you put together so many people in that size, and you expect everybody to fit in from the beginning.
Yes.
And they have
yes, I think you're right, and you don't have to go any further than to yourself. When visiting a new town, I immediately have the feeling that it would be very difficult for me to live in a place like that. It really would be. And so I can understand if they are having problems in these new towns.
To think of it, all those new structures, new towns and suburbs, they to me they look the same wherever you get in Europe. They are, of course, there are different architectures and there are differences if you really look at them closely, but they are the same in one way. But on the other hand, when you travel, for instance, through Brittany and in those old places, they don't look the same as they do in, for instance, Normandy or in Germany or Sweden or elsewhere. You can feel that you are in a specific locality, in a region, and this I think it's very important. And you can see, for instance, the newly built houses in Brittany. They are in the local style. They keep things of the local style in them.
Yes.
But in the new towns, the style is only new.
Yes.
One thing that astonished me in Evry was that they had tried so very hard to make everything perfect. They had used a lot of money. They had planned as good as possible. They had used good architects, and they had invested in a big center which had not only trade but also culture and such things. And they had used expensive materials, not only concrete. They tried very hard, and I think that is the best suburb area I have seen. But on the other hand, still there is a great difference between this type of area and, for example, Paris. I mean, you can never create an urban milieu like the one that has had the possibility to grow up in a long time.
No, you can jump over the steps.
No.
We have traveled through a landscape here where the bocage it's very typical, and now the problem is, should we keep it? Can we keep it? And for many reasons, I suppose it will be impossible to just freeze a landscape. You couldn't do that. You have to change it if you are going to live in it, and that are problems that I am dealing in with Sweden, in Sweden, and try to understand what has been the processes behind changes in the landscape. And so in that sense, Brittany is a very good comparison. It gives you a new dimension of the change of landscape.
Well, I was, on that question, I was speaking with the students who followed us, the French students, Noël and other ones, and how they are working on the changing of the landscape now with the bocages and the environmental effects of this. And I felt that they are trying to both to change the landscape, but also to keep some of the bocages and to transform some structures of the old landscape into the new one. And I think this is something that we should bring back to Sweden also.
Morley was one of the first towns in the West to have a club, a kind of political club before the revolution. It has its own mind, but at the same time, it's a...
But still, you have the idea that in Sweden the exchange between urban and rural life is much stronger. There are stronger links between urban and rural life in Sweden than in Bretagne. Mm-hmm. Once you get out on the countryside, you have a feeling of the countryside as being a self-sufficient community, separated from the urban life, which could also possibly explain some of the political difficulties we've encountered, or rather the difficulties to interpret political life in Bretagne. Yeah. I mean, I was very struck by this situation that you could travel through villages, you could hear about village life that was obviously conservative in an everyday sense of the term. But still, people in those villages voted communist or socialist and were obviously radical in a political sense. Mm. And as being a Swede, it's very hard to interpret those relations because we are sort of schooled to think in terms of left and right in an institutional sense. Yes. And what is left in a political sense then, is a number, a list of categories, and what is right is another list of categories, and those two lists are incompatible with one another. Mm. But here in Bretagne, I have this feeling that left and right, conservative and radical, could mingle with one another, in a sense that makes them very hard to interpret. Mm. Mm. And I think that their base for making political decisions is their region, or their belonging to a commune, their belonging to a, even smaller place. While we in Sweden tend to base our political decisions upon our roles in the working life.
Yeah. Mm. Here you come into the identity of the region, more on the local plan. I have one picture which is in my eyes. It's when I look out from the bus, I see old people with the bread.
Yes. They're coming with their breads.
Yes,
in the morning and in the
everywhere.
Afternoon and in the afternoon.
And there are, I see children, I see elderly people, and everyone. I connect this with their lives. The bread, it's important. They have it. You can see it in the morning or in the evening, and they are running. They are going down the streets, out in the forest, or everywhere. So, that is one memory that I have.
Mm. But still, I have this feeling also. We were talking about that just some minutes ago of a region that has a strong sense of being a region. Although a region, of course, can't have a sense of being, but the people in this region have a strong sense of belonging to the Britain region. Yes. And I think also I've had that impression that people here still here, we're still in Rennes, but I think people want to keep their way of life, and their way of life is largely industrial. No, pardon, of course, it's largely agricultural.
Yes.
and that industrial measures are, I think they will be hard to implement them.
I think that's a good idea to see that that one thing that perhaps we want to take with us or to learn is how to be proud of something that we have seen here. I mean, to live by the nature and take that we give from the nature, and to be proud of that. Don't make any other mixtures, and try to see what we have and what we could get out of that.
Although this might mean a lower level of welfare in an industrial sense.
In industrial sense,
yes.
But not in a more human.
No, or broader.
A broader way of
yeah.
welfare.
Exactly.
What do you say?
Yes, what is the future of Britain?
I think that too.
And what should we learn
on the
from
other hand,
this
it
journey?
is possible.
We asked our travel companion
work
Bill
out
Mead
that
to make
only
some reflections.
You have had some contact in your home country with minority languages and the Celtic minority languages. What do you think about the future of for example, Breton?
Oh, they're here to stay, of course. They will be strengthened. They won't be weakened. The same applies to Welsh in Wales. I mean, as you know, there are more than 1 million people who speak Welsh to each other in their homes. That's no small number, and it's here to stay. And given the emphasis on minority groups at the present time, I mean, I'm quite sure it will be strengthened. You do know, of course, that the Cornish language is back again. It died out at the end of the 18th century, as you remember, yes. But it's back again. And
well, now we come back to Sweden and we'll watch this film back in Sweden. What can we bring back with us, and perhaps what can Swedish geographers and Swedish researchers do with this perspective that you have given us?
I think this is a very difficult question to answer. It's a highly individual matter. What I think is very important always to remember, probably a little more difficult in Sweden than it is with us, because we have larger numbers of academic geographers, and one can spread the net rather more widely. But I still think that there ought to be room, as it were, in the great family of geographical activity for some people who can, as it were, swallow something whole and adopt something whole in a temporal sense as well as in a spatial sense, if one may put it that way. They will undoubtedly make all sorts of errors, and they will contradict themselves from time to time and from decade to decade naturally. They don't have to be afraid of criticism. But I think that this kind of person has so much to offer, if I may put it that way, to the generality of mankind. There is, after all, here in France, the Annales School, which is very much alive and kicking. Do we have a geographer? I mustn't talk about France. Do we have a geographer in England? No, we don't. Who can put it over, as it were, like Ladoury can put it over. Here's the envy of so many British historical geographers. But he's down there in detail, but he's got the wide sweep and he's got theoretical ideas. And this kind of person is an enormous popularizer as well. Think in terms of the tens of thousands of his publication of Montagu, without going any farther, that have appeared in paperback here in England. It's sold everywhere, on bookstores, railway stations. The geographers started trying to do this and succeeding in the 1950s, but it hasn't continued. This is the sort of thing that the general public wants. The archaeologists have succeeded at home, the historians have succeeded at home. Geographers not in the same way, with the broad vision. Historical geography of England and Wales, yes, it has succeeded, partly through the historians as well as the geographers, of course. I suppose my own former professor, Professor Darby, has done much to popularise this particular point of view. But among us there ought to be some who can adopt the broad view and the long time perspective. Of course, they've got to be able to withstand criticism and to accept it, and they can't help but build up wrong theories and misinterpret things, but then it's for others to correct them, and perhaps to correct them with the same breadth of view and attitude.
So historical geography is coming back.
Well, it's not coming back. It's come back, but this isn't, strictly speaking, a historical geography as we see it today. But I still think there's room for someone, the right kind of person. It's got to be a rather brilliant kind of person, and it's got to be someone who can put it over in an intensely personal way, I think, and have personal contact with people at the grassroots level as well as the grand vision beyond. But that is one of the memories we shall all take back from this part of the world, I'm sure, having been in the company of someone who is there at the grassroots level, but who has the grand vision as well.
It was a very intensive week. We got filled with new impressions. Sometimes it got too much, but most of the time it was thrilling, inspiring, and we really had a good time together. In Rennes, we thank Professor FLATRES for his indispensable contribution. We left Paris Sunday evening. We said goodbye to Anne, who stayed for another month. It was thanks to her and her contacts in France that this excursion was made possible. We thank her for a wonderful experience and all unforgettable memories.